I'll never forget the sound. It wasn't just a baby's cry, it was sharp, urgent, and desperate. The kind of sound that makes you stop mid-step no matter what you're doing. It was late morning at Miller's Diner, that quiet, between hour when the rush of breakfast had passed and the lunch crowd hadn't yet wandered in. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and cinnamon from the pies cooling in the kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the tall front windows, catching the dust motes as they floated lazily in the air. The radio hummed softly with an old country tune, the kind you only half hear but hum along to without thinking. Everything felt calm, except for that one sound in the corner. That's where I recognized him. A man alone in a booth, shoulders slightly bent, one hand around a coffee cup that had obviously gone cold a very long time ago. He wasn't glancing up. His eyes were on the table, as if he was somewhere very far away in his head. Next to him, in a black stroller, was the cause of that shriek of pain. The baby's tiny faces flushed red, little fists waving wildly in the air, kicking under a soft blue blanket. The cry wasn't one that automatically stopped after a few moments. This one had a rhythm to it, the long, deep wail, followed by a quick gasp for breath and then another wail. It was the scream of a person who was too little to say anything, but one which was loud enough to ensure the entire world heard something was amiss. The man leaned in occasionally now and then, gently rocking the stroller back and forth with one foot, muttering something to himself. The baby just cried harder, each wail cutting through the quiet diner like a knife. A couple of customers glanced over, some with visages melted in sympathy, others with that look people have when they've noticed it's not their issue. I cleaned down the counter, not looking, but truthfully, I couldn't take my eyes off the scene. Something about him. He didn't look careless or annoyed, like some people might when they can't calm a child. He looked lost. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosened like he'd been wearing it for far too many hours. There was a faint shadow of stubble on his jaw, the kind that comes when shaving just doesn't seem important anymore. In that moment, I felt an ache in my chest. I didn't know this man. I didn't know his story. But I knew what it felt like to be tired, to feel like you were trying your best and still coming up short. I looked toward the kitchen. We always kept a few bottles of milk in the back for customers with little ones. Without overthinking, I grabbed one, warmed it just enough so it wouldn't be too hot, and walked over to his table. The crying seemed to grow louder with every step I took, as if the baby was calling me, which was impossible. Still, something within my gut told me to be there. I stood beside the booth, holding the bottle in one hand. "Excuse me," I said softly, just loud enough to speak above the wailing. "May I?" He looked up at me then, and I saw his eyes for the first time. A sharp, clear blue, but ringed with exhaustion. It was the kind of look people get when they've been awake far too long, and the weight of the world is resting squarely on their shoulders. For a moment, he didn't answer. His gaze flicked from my face to the bottle, then back again, as if he was trying to decide whether to trust a stranger. Finally, he gave a small nod. I reached for the baby, moving slowly so I wouldn't startle him. As soon as I lifted him from the stroller, his crying softened just a little, like he knew something was about to change. He was so tiny in my arms, his head fitting neatly under my chin, his little hands clutching the fabric of my uniform like he'd been holding on for dear life. I offered him the bottle, tilting it just enough for the warm milk to reach the tip. The moment it touched his lips, the change was instant. The wails faded into soft, eager sucking sounds. His eyes fluttered closed, his small body relaxing against me. I could feel the tension in the air ease, even from the man across the table. He leaned back, exhaling a breath I don't think he realized he'd been holding. For the first time since I'd seen him, the lines in his forehead softened. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, his voice low, almost hoarse. "I know," I replied with a small smile, rocking the baby gently. "But I couldn't just stand there." He hesitated, his eyes dropping for a moment before meeting mine again. His mother, she passed away 3 weeks ago. I'm still figuring things out. The words hung between us. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't push for more. Some things don't need questions, just presence. So I stood there, swaying gently with the baby until his bottle was empty, letting the quiet stretch around us. For the first time all morning, there was peace in the corner of the diner. "Excuse me," I said softly. For the first time all morning, there was peace in the corner of the diner. "Excuse me," I said softly, bending at the knees so I wouldn't tower over the stroller, my voice carrying that careful, gentle tone you use when you're not sure if you're interrupting something private. The man looked up sharply, as though he'd been pulled from a deep thought, his eyes a striking shade of blue, but ringed with the heavy shadows of sleepless nights. For a moment, he didn't speak, as if measuring whether to let me into this fragile little world he and his crying child were trapped in. Then, barely noticeable, he nodded once, as if a man yielding not in defeat but in relief. I stooped down and picked up the baby with all the gentleness I could manage, his small body warm and shuddering against me, not more than 6 months old, so light that I could feel each little gasp beneath my collarbone. His little hands clung to my uniform like I was the first bit of safety he'd touched in hours. His face still flushed but softening as I offered him the warmed bottle. The change was instant. The desperate wails faded into steady rhythmic sucking, his eyelids fluttering closed as though the weight of the world had been lifted from his tiny shoulders. I swayed gently from side to side, letting him feel the motion, the closeness, the quiet, while the father sat across from me in the booth, saying nothing at first, his gaze fixed not on me but on his son, watching as though trying to memorize the sight of him finally at peace. After a long moment, he cleared his throat and said quietly, "You didn't have to do that," his voice carrying both gratitude and something almost like shame. "I know," I replied simply, offering a small smile without looking away from the baby. But I couldn't just stand there. He looked away at that, his jaw tightening as if he was trying to keep his emotions in check. "His mother," he began, pausing before the words came out heavy and halting. "She passed away 3 weeks ago. I'm still figuring things out." My heart sank into the floor, the air between us thick with the weight of what he'd just shared. I wanted to say something comforting or wise, but I knew that sometimes silence speaks louder, so I kept rocking the baby, listening to his soft breathing as he finished the last drops of milk. My thoughts lingering on how a simple act, one warm bottle, one willing pair of arms, could bridge the gap between strangers and ease a pain that words could never fully reach. When the baby had finished, I gently returned him to the man, pulling the blanket up close so that it wrapped around his tiny body. "There you go," I smiled. "Full belly, happy heart." The man received him gently, his hands firm, but his eyes still a faraway quality, as if his mind was sorting through something greater than the morning's happenings. He looked at me for a long time before the edges of his mouth crept upward into a small, exhausted smile. Not one of those fleeting, courteous smiles people produce automatically, but something softer, truer, the kind born of a deep place of quiet thankfulness. "You remind me of someone," he said, his voice containing a blend of curiosity and wistfulness. I smiled, a small laugh inclining my head, hopefully someone nice, that elicited a low laugh from him, and finally, a hint of relaxation smoothed out on his face. He caught a glance at the clock on the wall, the second hand's tick in the silence between us, then returned his gaze to me. I don't normally do this," he confessed, as if the act of speaking it aloud would make him violate his own rule, "but would you like to have lunch with us?" My treat, as a rule, I would have smiled and said no, waitresses don't sit down with patrons, at least not in their own diner. But there was something in the way he spoke, the stillness of sincerity in his voice, which made me understand this had nothing to do with the food. So when my shift came to an end an hour later, I tied back my apron, smoothed down my uniform, and slid into that corner booth facing him. The baby slept soundly in the stroller next to us, his small chest swelling and deflating in a steady rhythm that seemed to soothe the air around us. During the next hour, the man, Daniel, as he told us, started revealing bits and pieces of his tale. He had been in town for a meeting in the morning, but his nanny canceled at the last minute, and he was forced to take his son with him. I figured he would sleep through it. Daniel shook his head with a small smile. But plans didn't really work out. As he talked, I could sense the tightness in his shoulders slowly unraveling bit by bit, as if merely discussing it was allowing some of the load to slip away. "I used to have everything under control," he confessed, his gaze on the coffee cup between his hands. "Now I can hardly make it through the day." I edged a little closer, elbows on the table, wanting him to pick up on the earnestness in my voice. "You're doing better than you imagine," I said to him. "You arrived. You're here. That's more important than good plans." He glanced up at me then, his eyes steady, as if he was actually hearing me. And for a second, it was as if we weren't waitress and customer anymore, but two individuals who had come together at precisely the right time in each other's lives. If you'd like, I can now. Continue section 4, the revelation in the same engaging format. So the suspense leading up to the twist of him being a billionaire hits with maximum emotional resonance. Would you like me to do so? After lunch, when the final crumbs of pie had been swept away and the baby was sleeping peacefully in his stroller, Daniel dug into his jacket for his wallet, the muffled clink of coins and the gentle slide of leather on the table shattering the peace. But before he was able to open it, the other waitress working that day, a younger girl with her hair pulled back into a sloppy bun, came over and smiled. "It's already been taken care of, sir," she said, her voice bright, as though she were presenting a small gift. I scowled, looking from her to Daniel. "By whom?" I asked, confused. She leaned her head towards the counter where old Mr. Miller himself was polishing a coffee mug, smiling like he had a secret. "That man over there." But Mr. Miller merely shrugged, and I turned back to Q, find Daniel eyeing me with that same low, enigmatic smile I'd already noticed, the one that suggested there was more to his tale than he'd told me. "You," I began, my voice fading away on a note of incredulity. He breathed in softly, like a man who'd been holding a truth in his pocket since morning and at last decided to put it down. "I wasn't entirely truthful before," he confessed, leaning back in the booth as if providing space for the words to settle. "I own a business, a pretty big one, and I guess folks would say I'm a billionaire." For a moment, I just stood there, staring at him, the word billionaire suspended between us like a note that wasn't quite part of the song. A billionaire, here, at Miller's Diner. Under almost absurd circumstances, the man who had been soothing a wailing baby in a crumpled shirt and open collar now informing me that he was one of the richest individuals in the Danian. Daniel merely shrugged, a small, wistful smile playing around his lips. "When your baby is crying and you have no idea what to do," he spoke softly, "you assisted me at a time when I needed it, without knowing who I am. That's not common." His words fell gently but were heavy with meaning, and my cheeks flushed, although I wasn't altogether sure why. Folks fantasize about meeting somebody wealthy and influential, envisioning flash and extravagance, but at that moment I did not see a billionaire before me. I recognized the man who had seemed completely lost an hour before, the father who'd whispered to his child in his bid to calm him down, the man who'd accepted assistance not because he was who he was, but because he needed it. And I understood something. Title and fortune may impress the world, but in the booth of a small town diner, it was only important that he was a weary father who loved his boy above all. Before he departed, Daniel stood up from the booth, his son nestled against his chest, the baby's small head nestled under his chin as if it had always been there. He regarded me for a very long time, his face more relaxed now, devoid of tension like I saw when I approached with that bottle. "Kaspachin, you reminded me today that kindness is still out there," he said, his tone calm but with a heavy quiet, "and I'd like to pay you back." I shook my head almost reflexively, a small laugh breaking through. "You don't owe me anything," I said to him, and I really did mean it. But Daniel just gave one of those knowing smiles, the sort that said he had already decided on something. Reaching into the inner pocket of his jacket, he produced a plain white envelope and placed it softly on the table between us. "It's not about owing," he said. "It's about giving back." I didn't open it immediately. Part of me didn't want to. Not here. Not now. He shifted the diaper bag strap across his shoulder, nodded politely in the direction of the counter, and, turning for one final look, departed out into the sunlight. I remained there, observing him cross the street, his form diminishing until the diner door closed behind him and the stillness of the afternoon fell around me. When I finally got into the booth and opened the envelope, my breath caught. A handwritten note in careful, deliberate script lay inside for the woman who fed my son when I couldn't. "Use this to make your own dreams a little closer." A check was folded underneath the paper, not for a small token sum, but for more than I'd ever laid eyes on in my life. Enough to wipe away every debt that had been keeping me up at night. Enough to patch the roof on my mother's old house before another winter storm. Enough to finally take the leap and open the little bakery he'd been sketching plans for on the backs of order pads during slow shifts. My fingers shook holding it, reality closing in like the heat of sun after days of chill. I remained there for what seemed like hours, the noise of the other tables receding into a background hum, considering the way a tiny thing, a warm bottle, a soft hand, an inclination to move toward another rather than away, had altered the trajectory of two lives in the course of a morning, his and mine. And now, whenever I hear the cry of a baby, I'm transported back to that time in the diner. Not for the cash, not even for the surprise of who he had become, but for the realization that kindness, when given without condition, comes full circle to you in ways you could never design and always at the time when you least expect it.